Is debt beating you down? You need discipline. You need the Debt Ninja. If you've been caught in a financial trap and need to be set free, then you need the Debt Ninja. Want to stop those harassing collection calls, start saving thousands in interest and fees, and get out of debt fast? Then you need to call the Debt Ninja. The Debt Ninja will find the best companies across the country that will help you consolidate all your bills into one easy payment, reduce your payments by 30 to 50%, and get you out of debt fast. If you have unsecured debt of $10,000 or more, such as credit cards, loans, or medical bills, call the Debt Ninja for a free 15-minute consultation.
Call 800-826-1246. 800-826-1246. That's 800-826-1246. Call today.
The Debt Ninja.
Individuals and businesses with tax problems, listen carefully. Do you feel like you're losing control over your finances? If you owe over $10,000 in back taxes or have unfiled tax returns, we can help you take back control. The IRS is the largest and most aggressive collection agency in the world, and they can seize your bank account, garnish your paycheck, close your business, and file criminal charges. Take control of your tax problems now by calling the experts at Tax Mediation Services and take advantage of the Fresh Start program and new laws that may allow us to negotiate a settlement for the lowest amount possible. Our team of tax attorneys and enrolled agents can stop collections and get you protected so you can take control of your financial future. Tax Mediation Services is accredited by the Better Business Bureau. Call now for a free case review and a price protection guaranteed quote.
Call Tax Mediation Services now at 800-610-9050. That's 800-610-9050. 800-610-9050.
All writers are prone to becoming so attached to our characters and stories that we struggle to see why a passage may not be working. It takes another set of eyes to help us nurture our writing to full maturity. At Black Wolf Editorial Services, we strive to enable writers to develop and grow, shaping stories into masterpieces that can stand the test of time. Editing services are provided for all genres and all age categories. Services range from critiques of the short story through to line edits of the full-length novel and copy editing for those preparing for publication. We also offer assistance on generating a writer's bio for your websites, as well as help with those book blurbs and promotional material. We won't abandon you to the masses. We want to celebrate with you in your successes. Black Wolf Editorial Services, nurturing your writing into maturity. For a full list of services and prices, visit us at blackwolfeditorial.com.
This is Slickery Trigger for Rebel Road Tactical. With proper care and feeding, your pistol will be ready when you need it, there to save your life. Shouldn't your gear be that good? Whether you need a holster for comfortable everyday carry or a tough-as-nails holster for your next training course, Rebel Road Tactical has what you need. Check us out on the web at rebelroadtactical.com.
You're listening to the Spark Radio Network, internet radio like you've never heard before. Innovation, creativity, and imagination are all said to begin with a spark. So fasten your seatbelt and take the ride of your life and listen for the spark.
You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
My name is Jessie. I'm a United States Special Forces widow. This gives me a unique perspective on the world around us. If you're willing to listen, I'll tell you how I see it, and I won't pull any punches. This is my POV, which stands for point of view.
All right, this is Jessie. How y'all doing? You know I miss you when I'm not talking to you. I really do. I'm not alone today. My recurring favorite guest, Justin Kinney, is back with me. And today's topic is religious terrorism and our approach to it. How you doing today, Justin?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, you are a fantastic guest and so knowledgeable. I always look forward to hearing from you. All right, so before we get into religious terrorism, why don't you give us just the quick thumbnail definition of terrorism so we can compare and contrast it to religious terrorism a little bit?
Sure. That's actually a little more tricky than you might think, because there's a lot of disagreement about terrorism, especially when you go global, because there's the kind of common saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So there's kind of a little bit of a distinction here. But the general definition is any group that uses violence or intimidation in the pursuit of some sort of political, social, or religious aim or goal.
All right. I think that was the kind of definition I was looking for there, Justin. And I know you can have 3 people on this topic and 6 opinions.
Absolutely.
So, all right. So what makes, obviously with religious terrorism, they've got a religious goal, but what else makes them different?
So religious terrorism differs from other forms of terrorism for a couple of reasons. And there's a famous terrorist scholar named Bruce Hoffman. He characterizes having 3 different traits that you almost always see in it. Usually it's having some sort of religious goal or aim in addition to any sort of other goals. So, for instance, like ISIS right now, they want to end the world. That's their religious aim, but they also have a political aim of wanting their own state as well. And so you'll sometimes see kind of an overlap of the two. But religious terrorism has to have some sort of religious or theological aim to their goals. You'll also see religious terrorism tend to have clerical figures in some sort of leadership capacity. And then frequently you will see apocalyptic images of destruction as some sort of justification for their actions or to explain why they're doing what they're doing or even to gain recruits.
Okay, so that sounds a lot like Daesh or ISIL and the Islamic State in Baghdadi.
Yes, it is. There would be a classic case of religious terrorism.
All right, so how do we have to approach religious terrorism differently than, say, what happened with the IRA or those with purely political motives? That's
a great question, and I think it's important to take a step back and go a little bit into history. Last time I was on the show, we talked about kind of the different waves of terrorism. There's the anarchist wave, the anti-colonial wave, the new left wave, and the religious wave, which is what we're in right now. And if you look historically, these waves of modern terror have lasted about 40 years or so on average. And if you look at the religious wave that we're currently in, that started in about 1980. And so we're actually coming close to the end of the wave, assuming it follows the same trend as these other 3. The problem is... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So do you think they are going to end soon, or do you think they're going to manage to somehow fight the trend and keep on going?
That's a question a lot of people are trying to answer. And what we're seeing is that there may be some indications that religious terrorism is in some way a different phenomenon than, say, an anarchist group. We're seeing, especially in the last few years, a real rise in it, instead of what you would expect to be kind of a diminishment as we're getting close to the end. And we're seeing religious terrorism being different and more difficult to combat. Partly maybe because they're looking to their faith as a sort of inspiration, and that's a harder thing to combat than, say, just simply a political goal. You would think when somebody looks to their faith as a source of inspiration or their worldview, this provides a unique incentive structure that's not there in political terrorism. You tend to see religious terrorists fight harder. They fight longer, so they'll last longer in battle. They cause more devastation and death. There's a statistic, I think it's from roughly 98 to 2005 or so, about 6% of all terrorist acts were religious in nature, but they caused 30% of all the deaths.
Wow, now that's
they
something...
cause a lot more devastation.
That was something I didn't know, that religious terrorists cause more devastation than excuse the term, garden variety political terrorist.
They do, and there's a lot of debate as to why that is. It's probably because religious terrorists tend to discount survival more than a secular terrorist that's fighting for some other goal. They they don't care as much about their own personal survival, maybe because they believe in an afterlife that they're going to be rewarded in, or maybe this is something that's more intrinsic to who they are as a person. Faith is usually something that's very deeply held, much more so than, say, political beliefs on average. And so they tend to discount their own survival a lot more than, say, a secular group would.
So is that...
you also will often find... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, is that where the 72 virgins come in?
Probably, yeah. That when you have some sort of afterlife reward system, then this life doesn't matter as much. Whether it's 72 virgins or whatever else, your belief system, promises you for being a martyr, your current life tends to matter less when you believe there's something beyond. And so you're more willing to fight, longer, harder. You're more willing to put your life on the line. And in particular, you tend to cause, again, more devastation, more death because of that.
All right, so I know when I have a religion and everything, I do have an understanding of afterlife. So these terrorists are truly not even scared by death. So how do we defeat them?
Yeah, that's where it gets really tricky, and it's something that we are learning as we go along. Because, as I said, this is kind of a newer wave. It's only been around the last 35 years. Well, I shouldn't say that. There has been religious terrorism for centuries. It's really taken off in the last 30 to 35 years. And it gets tricky because, religious terrorism often has an ideology that's very uncompromising. So things like, compromising and giving in, making concessions doesn't seem to work the same way it does with political terrorist groups. We've seen political groups, it doesn't happen a lot, but we've seen them give in and make peace, sometimes even stop committing acts of terror entirely just by offering them concessions, what they want.
The IRA, they pretty much, you don't hear about them blowing up nightclubs anymore.
They've essentially gone away. The ETA in Spain, the Basques group, they haven't committed much of anything for a long time. So we have seen these kind of political or ethnic-based groups, stop committing acts of terror, or at least diminish it when they're given concessions. When we're doing that with religious terrorist groups, that doesn't seem to be working, at least not nearly to the extent that it does for political groups. So concessions has historically been a way to help, mollify these groups, but it's not working here. So that kind of leads to what's the next stage, how do we do it? And there's a couple of things countries have tried to do. There's groups like France, countries like France that are trying to curtail some of this religious expression and hoping that can cut back on it. You hear about their burqa bans and their restriction on religious attire. Belgium, labeled certain non-violent religious groups as dangerous, put them more in the public eye. India has some discriminatory policies against religious minorities to keep them down. So they've tried this kind of religious repression.
Have you ever heard of Japan's...
That doesn't work.
I'm sorry, but have you ever heard about Japan's immigration restrictions against Muslims? They just don't admit them.
I have, and that's another tactic that some countries are going down. But we are finding, though, that religious repression and this sort doesn't seem to do a whole lot in the long term, because it actually, what it does is it has a tendency to weaken the moderates in a particular faith. So, say it tends to weaken the more moderate Muslims, say in the Middle East, but it increases support for extremists because now it's creating kind of an us versus them mentality. They perceive them as being under attack. It gives the extremists more justification. So we're seeing this kind of religious repression doesn't seem to work either. And so we're running into some difficulties with how do we combat this. And it's actually part of the reason why I suspect this wave will end up lasting longer than the other three have.
Okay, so if they're not scared of death and they think that Bakr al-Baghdadi is the eighth imam?
Yeah, I think he's the eighth.
And they think the rest are going to come in quick succession. And you brought up an interesting point just before we got on air that we believe some sources are reporting that Baghdadi is trapped in Mosul.
Yes, yeah, that's what they're reporting right now.
And then they attack Kirkuk, trying to go, hey, look over here, big shiny object blowing up, in their case. So they've lost Dabiq, their city where they believe their Messiah, for lack of a term, is going to come save them. So how are their plans going to change? What are they going to do? Are they going to try and retake Dabiq, or are they just going to accept the fact that Dabiq is no longer their city?
Yeah, that's a great question, and what we're seeing, at least so far, is that they've actually shifted in their rhetoric. They're now kind of downplaying that prophecy, saying, Dabiq wasn't as important as as we had claimed. It's not that important to the long-term goals. That wasn't correct. So they're kind of downplaying that prophecy a little bit. I don't know if that will continue or if they're going to fight to get it back. I imagine eventually they'll shift and start trying to fight to win Dabiq back. But at least temporarily, they're trying to really downplay that to make it seem like that's not as big of a deal as it would have been, say, 6 months ago.
Now, their magazine, is it still named Dabiq, or haven't you heard on that note?
It was last time I checked, and that was not that long ago. So unless they've changed it since Dabiq was overtaken, I imagine it's still called Dabiq.
Interesting. So they've changed the prophecy, but not changed the magazine title. Intriguing. So
yeah, they're trying to change the interpretation of it to say, it's not really that big of a deal. It's small potatoes compared to our long goal.
So are they still an apocalyptic group?
I would say yes. They are. Right now, they're kind of panicking, I believe. They're not quite sure how to handle Dabiq being lost, so I think they're kind of undergoing a little bit of a shift. It will be interesting to see what comes out in the next 2 to 3 months as they kind of regroup a little bit. They're probably not super worried about the ideology right now while they're under attack at Mosul, which is their kind of de facto capital. But they will have to kind of regroup and reconsolidate their ideology in the next month or two.
Well, okay, wait a minute. I thought Raqqa was their capital, at least in Syria.
In Syria. Mosul is their Iraqi capital.
Okay, and now Bakr al-Baghdadi did make the proclamation of the Islamic Caliphate from a mosque in Mosul. So you could say it's almost their spiritual capital.
I suppose you could do that. Mosul was one of the first towns that they really thought about taking over when they first erupted on the scene. It was one of their first goals was to take Mosul. It kind of became their de facto capital at the time. Then they moved to Syria, got involved in the war there. It overtook Dabiq, which took on a prophetic importance to them. Obviously, Raqqa as well. So they have a couple big cities that are important. Mosul is just one of their larger ones.
So if they actually, I'm seeing that it's going to take months to take back Mosul. What do you think about that?
I think that's probably right. And to be honest, because of the way they fight, they'll probably never be 100% certain that all the little factions are gone. It's hard to root out an entire group from one city when they, by nature, blend in with the population and they're willing to work among the civilians. It's going to be near impossible to make sure they're 100% gone. But practically speaking, it will be probably a few months before they have control of the city.
Okay, then what happens to Mosul after we eliminate the bulk of ISIS?
I think that's a great question, and it's going to have to be up to the local people. I think one of the things that we tend to do very poorly is coordinate with locals who are friendly to us, and we do this very poorly across Northern Africa, across the Middle East. There are a lot of people on the ground who are locals who also hate ISIS and these other groups, and they're willing to work with us, but we tend to do a very poor job of utilizing that. And so I think our next step has to be to work with those locals on the ground who already have established avenues of trust with the people. They know where to go, who the people are that are terrorists much better than we could ever figure out. And I think we have to utilize that.
So you think that we need to improve our relations with the locals, and do you also think that maybe that would include trying to bring in more Peshmerga? Although, do we really, or would that stir up more ethnic and religious violence in the Middle East?
That's a tough question to know for sure. I imagine that might actually end up stirring up more. I'm thinking more along the lines of the average civilian population. The peaceful the peaceful groups who are there. There's a lot of peaceful activists, especially across northern Africa, that are trying to combat the ideology, which I think is key to attacking terrorist groups, is to undermine their ideology. But they don't have the resources that they need to do this. And I think if we can just embolden some of these individuals and some of the local populations, that's the real key. Because when you look at even religious terrorist groups, start with the Middle East, terrorist groups all come to mind, but the majority of the people there aren't terrorists. The majority of them aren't even sympathizers. The majority are peaceful, and we need to utilize that a lot more than we really have been. I think in the past we've done that very poorly. We have a tendency to arm one insurgent group over another, and I think that's a mistake.
Yeah,
time and time again, we tend to see that backfiring.
Yeah. Just look at when we armed people against the Soviets in Afghanistan and what came out of that.
Absolutely. The Taliban was essentially armed by us, by the CIA. They weren't called the Taliban at the time, but they became the Taliban using U.S. weapons because we had seen it as kind of this anti-Soviet fight, during the Cold War. And all that backfired on us when the Taliban emerged using our own weapons against us. And we're seeing the same thing with ISIS now, is a lot of their weaponry is, Western made.
All right, so what we really need to do, instead of trying to pick winners and losers, is work with the civilians who essentially just want to go about their daily lives and be left alone and live in peace and quiet.
I believe so, because by utilizing them, they are probably the best resource we have. They are almost by nature a peaceful, ideology. The grand majority of them are not sympathetic to this cause. Most of them hate groups like ISIS. They want them gone as much as we do because they're the ones who are being oppressed by them. And so if we can utilize those people there, combat the ideology on the ground, that will effectively help cut off a lot of their recruiting tactics as well.
All right, so instead of trying to bring in our armed forces, although we may need to do some advising and assisting or quote-unquote special forces operations to take out the big cats.
Sure.
Work with the average citizen who doesn't want this chaos any more than we do.
Right, and we've mentioned on here before, the average victim of a terrorist attack is a Muslim, and they are well aware of that, and they don't like this happening in their lands. And if we can use them and embolden them and let them actually handle the majority of this combating of ideology, we can provide resources and whatever they need. But if we let them to take the bulk of it, they're a lot more trusting of one another than there would ever be of a foreigner coming in and trying to tell them, what they should do and believe.
Well, I don't think...
That said, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't think anyone wants somebody else of a different religious background coming in and say, well, you shouldn't believe in that, you need to believe in this. I can't see that going over well in any community.
Exactly, and it hasn't gone well. We've kind of tried that, with our invasions over there, and it backfired big time. I think if we had thought it through a little bit more ahead of time, we could have avoided some of this. We've just done a very poor job of engaging the people on the ground who would be sympathetic to the cause, or who, as you said, kind of want this even more than we do.
Right. And the other thing we were mentioning off air, you mentioned that you feel that ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, and I usually often refer to them as Daesh on my show because I don't like the other names that much. But anyway, that you feel that they're in a little bit of panic and chaos. And there were a couple of things you mentioned to me that I'd seen on the news, but I don't know that I've mentioned them to my listeners, that some Daesh fighters were trying to escape dressed as women. Do you think that's a sign of the chaos and panic?
I think it is, at least among the average foot soldier. During this invasion of Mosul, I think they're being really forced back. We've mentioned, al-Baghdadi is probably trapped there, at least that's what the reports are saying. And just a day or so ago, they announced that they were telling all of the women and children, the wives, the girlfriends to leave and to get out of Mosul where all the fighting was taking place. And that's usually a sign that they think something's going wrong. And what happened was several of the foot soldiers decided they didn't want to fight anymore and tried to escape with the women as well. And they did so by wearing women's clothes. There's some amusing pictures you can find online of it. They are just trying to get out of there as well. These aren't the leaders of the group, but a lot, I think, the average foot soldiers who are realizing that Mosul is a very dangerous place to be for them right now.
Oh, I have to agree. We've got the Peshmerga on two sides, I believe. I'd have to pull up a map, but I believe the northern and eastern side, and you've got the Iraqi army with the U.S. forces on the southern and eastern side. And by the way, for the record, there are U.S. forces also with the Peshmerga. Mm-hmm. So I
believe Obama just recently sent hundreds more forces over there just recently.
And that doesn't count the air power. However, I will say that ISIS has been attempting to thwart air power they created a moat around Mosul filled with oil and lit it on fire. Hey, environmentalists, why don't you rail against Daesh or ISIS and see how far you get? Sorry, I had to insert that one. Do you think this wave of terrorism is going to hang on longer?
I do, and it's hard to know how long, but they don't seem to be slowing down like you would expect getting towards the end of their wave, and just the nature of religion being a little more inherently held than political ideology, I believe that it's going to be a little harder to end this wave and move on to whatever the fifth wave will end up being.
I've also been seeing some people talking about cyber terrorism. So do you think the fifth wave and the fourth wave, if the fifth wave is cyber terrorism, do you think the fifth and the fourth are going to run concurrently for a while?
It's certainly possible. We have seen multiple waves kind of overlap in the past. As one slowly dies out and the next one takes over. We've seen them run a little bit concurrently for a few years. So that's certainly a possibility if cyber ends up being the next wave of things, which is possible. Problem with cyber terrorism is that in order to be effective at it, you almost have to have a state's backing because you need to have the resources and the money and things to do it. It's hard to do it, when you're kind of a poor group in the middle of nowhere. So that may end up being more of a state tool than a terrorist tool, but there are certainly groups like, say, Anonymous that have the capabilities to do some damage if they really wanted to.
Oh, in fact, while we were recording, Internet infrastructure company DYN says third well-planned and executed denial of service attack is underway. Came across my phone.
I'll have to check that out.
And also, I know there was another denial of service attack overnight on the Northeast. And for the record, we are recording on the 21st, and you will hear it on the 22nd. So this news will only be one day outdated, folks. And I don't call that outdated in the world when it comes to world of terrorism. Because unless we can get ISIS to dry up and blow away overnight, which I highly doubt, Justin, this is still going to be a relevant topic tomorrow.
No, it absolutely will. And I mean, we've been talking about kind of this challenging ideology on the ground, and that's really a long-term strategy. That's not going to change hearts and minds overnight. That cuts off recruiting arms, so that they can't recruit new members. But that doesn't do a whole lot for the people who are already members. So even if we use that tactic, and even if it's wildly successful, that's still a long-term strategy. That's nothing that's going to help much in the short term.
So what should we do in the short term? I mean, obviously we can't change our interaction with the locals on the ground overnight, although we can try. But that doesn't mean they're going to trust us tomorrow if they didn't trust us today. So we've got months probably of fighting to retake Mosul and get rid of, we'll say, the bulk of Daesh from that place and give the civilians some much-needed breathing room. Because there are between 1 and 1.5 million civilians still trapped in Mosul.
Right, yeah. In the short term, that gets really tricky really fast because there's not a whole lot you can do in the short term. You can start laying the groundwork for things in the long term. It's never too late to start trying to make these efforts to bond with the locals and to embolden them to do what needs to be done. In the meantime, I think a military presence is important. I think we need to keep forcing them out of places like Mosul. You're not going to change the minds of everybody, even if the ideology is wildly successful. And we change it. That's not going to change everybody. That will change the new recruits. That will change the average foot soldier maybe, on the ground if they only joined because they wanted a job or something. But it's really not going to change much of the hierarchy of the group. And I think to defeat them, you either need to find some way to de-radicalize people, which there's been kind of scant evidence that it works much in the past, a little bit of evidence, but not a lot, or you need to eliminate them militarily.
Right. And another interesting news story, you know me, I'm just the consummate news junkie. I was just scrolling through Press TV, which for your information, Justin, if you're not familiar, and for my listeners' information, full disclosure, is Iranian news in English. Thank you. My Farsi and Arabic are not that strong, folks. And it says that they had technicians in Kirkuk. Doesn't say what kind of technicians, but it says that a senior Iranian diplomat says the Islamic Republic, i.e. Iran, will bring its technicians back home from the northern Iraqi oil city of Kirkuk following a deadly attack by Daesh on a power station and other buildings nearby the city. So even Iran is going, hey, guys, this ain't working. And I think the technicians were oil-related because of the oil fields in Kirkuk. But I'm sorry, I don't think ISIS has the resources at present to do major battles on two fronts. Yeah, they can blow stuff up a little bit away from Mosul or Raqqa, but I don't think they've got enough manpower. And I pray I'm right on this, that they don't have the manpower to actually have ongoing, seriously long-held fights in Mosul, Raqqa, and Kirkuk.
Yeah, that's going to be tricky. I mean, ISIS is probably considered the wealthiest terrorist group of all time. I think at their height they're worth over $2 billion. But that's being able to fight on multiple fronts like that takes more than wealth, and frankly, it takes more than people, because you need to have training, you need to have a certain amount of resolve, and a group that is relatively new, and we're talking in the last few years, they don't have that loyalty that say a country of centuries or at least decades has. So fighting on multiple fronts like that takes a certain level of hierarchy, coordination, leadership that it will be very tricky for them to maintain, even despite their wealth in the area.
So basically, their fighters could just say, skip this, I can find a better job in a bakery, and move on.
It's certainly possible, especially at the very low-level foot soldier. You have people who are fighting. I mean, maybe they believe it, but there's a reason they're not high up in the hierarchy. And they might decide it's just not worth it anymore. And frankly, I think that's part of what you use the people on the ground for. A lot of those foot soldiers know people, they have friends or family. If we can utilize that to show them, hey, this isn't worth it, that's where I think you start to change hearts and minds.
Now, I was listening to some interviews from some on-the-ground Iraqi soldiers the other day, and one guy was like, I haven't even told my family I'm at the front, because what do you tell your families and your children about being at the front? How do you explain to them you might not come home? And so I found that very interesting. Yeah,
absolutely. That's got to be difficult for anybody who's fighting on the front lines of battle. And it's important that the Iraqis are leading a lot of that. I think that's a really important thing long term for the battle. But that's got to be difficult. These are people who are fighting. And frankly, often they're even fighting people that they know. Because a lot of the ISIS fighters are locals, and that just gets really messy really fast.
And then we've got Turkey trying to stick its nose in and say, Mosul's important to us too. We got to have our say. And Iraq's going, Turkey, you get out of here. Now, all right, let's talk about religious scorecards for just a moment. All these groups are Muslim. However, and I'm getting out a pen and paper because I may need this scorecard in the future, Justin. Okay. ISIS or ISIL is predominantly which brand? They are Shia?
Well, actually, ISIS is kind of a weird offshoot. They're actually what's called Salafism, Salafi. It's kind of a branch off of Wahhabism, which I believe is actually a branch off of Sunni.
Okay, so in a way, they're sort of Sunni. They're a distant Sunni cousin. So ISIS is Sunni / Salafism?
Salafism, Salafi, it's the Salafi ideology. It's an ideological movement that's kind of within the Sunni Islam branch. But they're known for being much more fundamental than, say, your average Sunni.
All right, so then what is the majority of Iran? Are they Shia or Sunni or?
So the country of Iran actually has, I believe, the largest number of Shia Muslims in the world. They are, let me think. Iran, yeah, they're a lot more split, I believe. They have much more Shia than Sunni, which actually makes them unique. Worldwide, most Muslims fall under the Sunni heading by a large margin. I think it's like 90% are Sunni, or something very high. But Iran is actually more Shia than Sunni.
Okay, so Iran is more Shia than Sunni. ISIS is Salaf, which is a branch off Sunni. Saudi, isn't that where Wahhabism got its basic footholds?
Yes. So Saudi Arabia is essentially Wahhabi.
Okay, so
which is a branch off of Sunni as well. They're also Sunni.
Okay, so Saudi is Wahhabi and Sunni, and Iraq's divided. But what are its? We all know that it's kind of all over the place. But what are its overarching principles?
In Iraq, I'm sorry.
Yes, Iraq.
Okay, so Islam in Iraq is split between Shia and Sunni. I want to say it's like 2-1 Shia to Sunni, but it's certainly much more split than a lot of other countries. Now, they're a little bit more diverse as well in that sense. Most places are largely one or the other, but I want to say it's 60% Shia, 30% Sunni, something to that effect, and then 10% other.
And wasn't Saddam Hussein Sunni?
Yes.
So Saddam was taking the minority Sunnis to oppress the majority Shias, and that's how that whole internal Iraq conflict started.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. I think we're getting a good grip on the region here, because I know some of this is, I know Saddam's gone, so anybody trying to tell me, well, why are we talking about Saddam? Just because he's not alive doesn't mean what he did doesn't still have an impact.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was born Sunni. Essentially he ran things very secularly. He wasn't particularly concerned with theology, but he was Sunni, and he treated the Shia population absolutely brutally. And so when he, died, they had the first democratic elections, when we tried to install democracy there, the Shiites came to power because there were a lot more of them. And so they won elections, and they decided to kind of take out a lot of that frustration from the brutality that he inflicted, on the Sunnis, particularly the ones who were in his, group, his people. And so that's, part of what's still going on today is this Shia-Sunni divide in Iraq. They're having a pretty deadly sectarian conflict since then as well.
All right, so where does Turkey fit in on this religious map?
Okay, so Turkey is interesting because they're mostly Sunni. I want to say about 70% or so. But religion in Turkey is much more secular than the rest of the Middle East. Some of that's because they've been trying to play it down to join the EU. But they're technically, on that end of the religious spectrum. But it doesn't play as much of a role in their government. They're not as much a theocracy as some of the other places, and they don't hold the religious aspect nearly as dearly as some of the other places in the Middle East would, at least on average.
Okay, and that brings us to our favorite friend, Syria.
Okay, so Syria is about 75% Sunni. Again, most of the Arab world is actually Sunni. And then Shias would be the next one. But Islam is actually broken up a little bit more. They have, again, about 10% that don't fall in either of those categories either. Actually, if you ever follow the Alawites, they're a pretty predominant group in Syria. They have a lot of influence. They're part of the minority Shia population.
No, I hadn't followed them, so do tell. Tell me a bit more about them.
Okay, so the Alawites are a branch off of Islam. Again, they kind of follow the 12er school, so the 12 Mahdi. The 12 imams leading to the Mahdi, and they are kind of I would say, a fairly influential minority population in Syria and Turkey in particular. They have historically been a lot more secretive of their religious beliefs from outsiders. So there's kind of been a lot of rumors about them that, their day-to-day beliefs are a little more secretive on average. But they're considered kind of a fairly large sect in that region.
Okay, and do you know how much they influence things politically?
Actually, al-Assad is technically from this background, the Alawites. So Assad is essentially from this group of religious believers. So they've had quite a bit of influence.
Yeah, if the ruler of your country is from your own religious background, and in the Middle East, religion, and there is no separation between church and state in many places, folks. So any of you still holding to that notion, I'm sorry, you need to take a history class. So, is he also doing the minority oppressing the majority type thing?
In some ways, yes. He's not as concerned with theology as some of these others are. Much like Saddam Hussein, he kind of came out of this ideology, or this theology. But he's really just kind of a brutal guy who is willing to slaughter whoever disagrees with him. But yeah, in a sense, it's kind of this minority oppressing the majority. And during the Syrian civil war, the Alawite population has supported Assad, the Assad government, and they've really suffered because of it. I want to say like a third of the Alawite men in Syria have been killed in recent years because of this.
And they were killed by
mainly Sunni opposition.
Okay,
the Alawites are kind of they're a small bit of Shia, but they're kind of their own little sect of Shia, and so it's mostly Sunnis who oppose them, and they've like I said, up to a third or so of the men of the Alawite sect have been killed in this conflict.
All right, so I've been trying to get a good overview of the religion in this area, and I thank you for providing that. I know it wasn't quite the topic we were trying to bring to the forefront today, but without this background, it's hard to discuss the rest of it.
It is, and I don't claim by any stretch to be an expert on all the different sects of Islam and branches of it, but it's important to at least know the basic ideas behind them, because that actually explains a lot of the conflict that we're seeing. I mean, you can't understand Iraq right now if you don't understand the history of why Saddam oppressed certain peoples.
Right, and then, like you said, the split between Shia and Sunni goes back millennia, not just, hey folks, it's longer than a decade. It had to do literally with who was going to succeed Muhammad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it goes back a long way. So they've been fighting, ever since Muhammad essentially died, and there was conflict over who would take over for him.
Right, and that I don't think we're going to get them to agree next week, or next month, or even next year. I think that's just one of those, it's ingrained, and I don't think, no offense, there's a hill of beans we can do about it. It's not like we can force a religion, excuse me there, Justin, to have a reformation.
No, it's going to be very difficult, and too, as I mentioned before, Iran is kind of the big Shia country in the Middle East. Iraq will probably be second to them. Maybe Azerbaijan is up there as well. But the rest of the countries around them are primarily Sunni in nature, and so this conflict is all kind of stemmed in that one region of the world. And that traces all the way back 1,400 years or so to this, the 600 ADs when Muhammad died.
Right, and if they couldn't agree 1,400 years ago, I don't see them suddenly deciding, oh, well, we'll sit down and talk this out like quote unquote moderate people, because 1,400 years of separation does not get overcome at a table with a meeting, I don't think, Justin.
No, that's very difficult, and that really gets into their theology itself. Is how does succession get passed down? And one was bloodline essentially, and the other was to Muhammad's best friend, and that disagreement is not one that they take lightly.
And if you missed that episode, I believe that was our second episode that we did together, Justin.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to ask you to hold your thoughts while we take a commercial break, because I just looked up and we are past the bottom of the hour. My, oh my, how the time flies.
All right.
You can lay down if you wanna. You can run away if you wanna. You can pretend that this is totally okay if you wanna. You can play dead if you wanna. Forget what they said if you wanna. Turn your back on a country needing you right now, but I don't wanna.
The following message contains a special offer for listeners of this station. Are you a man over 40? Are you constantly looking for the nearest bathroom? Do you wake up multiple times a night to use the bathroom? Right now, Perfect Prostate is sending out free bottles of their groundbreaking new formula to listeners of this station. Perfect Prostate formula was developed by medical doctor Mitchell Fleischer, and its ingredients have been clinically studied to reduce your frequent nighttime bathroom visits and promote healthy urine flow. Right now, preferred customers get their first bottle of Perfect Prostate absolutely free. There's nothing to lose. Perfect Prostate is guaranteed to reduce that constant urge to use the bathroom, especially at night, and promote healthy urine flow. Don't wait. Call now for your free bottle. Just pay shipping and processing. Dial 1-800-675-0251. That's 1-800-675-0251. Supplies are limited. One free bottle per household. Call now. Dial 1-800-675-0251. That's 1-800-675-0251.
Individuals and businesses with tax problems, listen carefully. Do you feel like you're losing control over your finances? If you owe over $10,000 in back taxes or have unfiled tax returns, we can help you take back control. The IRS is the largest and most aggressive collection agency in the world, and they can seize your bank account, garnish your paycheck, close your business, and file criminal charges. Take control of your tax problems now by calling the experts at Tax Mediation Services and take advantage of the Fresh Start program and new laws that may allow us to negotiate a settlement for the lowest amount possible. Our team of tax attorneys and enrolled agents can stop collections and get you protected so you can take control of your financial future. Tax Mediation Services is accredited by the Better Business Bureau. Call now for a free case review and a price protection guaranteed quote.
Call Tax Mediation Services now at 800-610-9050. That's 800-610-9050. 800-610-9050.
All writers are prone to becoming so attached to our characters and stories that we struggle to see why a passage may not be working. It takes another set of eyes to help us nurture our writing into full maturity. At Black Wolf Editorial Services, we strive to enable writers to develop and grow, shaping stories into masterpieces that can stand the test of time. Editing services are provided for all genres and all age categories. Services range from critiques of the short story through to the line edits of the full-length novel and copy editing for those preparing for publication. We also offer assistance on generating a writer's bio for your websites, as well as help with those book blurbs and promotional material. We won't abandon you to the masses. We want to celebrate with you in your successes. Black Wolf Editorial Services, nurturing your writing into maturity. For a full list of services and prices, visit us at blackwolfeditorial.com.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
This is Slickery Trigger for Rebel Road Tactical. With proper care and feeding, your pistol will be ready when you need it. There to save your life. Shouldn't your gear be that good? Whether you need a holster for comfortable everyday carry or a tough-as-nails holster for your next training course, Rebel Road Tactical has what you need. Check us out on the web at rebelroadtactical.com.
You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
You can lay down if you wanna. You can run away if you wanna. You can pretend that this is totally okay if you wanna. You can play dead if you wanna. Forget what they said if you wanna. Turn your back on the country needing you right now, but I don't wanna.
All right, thank y'all for hanging in there with me. Got to pay those bills and keep those advertisers happy. All right, Justin. Now, we're on the topic of religious terrorism, and with the death of a service member over in Iraq, it brings up the fact that this soldier is going to have a funeral, which of course brings up Westboro Baptist Church. American terrorists, right?
Well, you know, the Westboro Baptist Church is an interesting group. I would not classify them as terrorists because to be a terrorist, you have to have some sort of violence, or at least a bare minimum, a threat of violence. And while they are some of the world's biggest jerks, they've never crossed that line, to my knowledge, into being violent. I don't think they've ever even laid a hand on somebody. They stay right on the other side of that line, intentionally so. I would not classify them as terrorist group per se. They're simply just jerks, essentially.
So the biggest jerks testing the First Amendment?
Yeah, one of their main leaders, I think her name's Shirley Phelps. She's like a constitutional scholar or a lawyer, and she makes sure that entire group, whatever they do, it toes that line very closely. They're essentially just using First Amendment rights, to say whatever hateful things they want to say. But again, to my knowledge, I don't think they've ever crossed that line into doing something violent.
Well, I don't think I've ever seen any violence committed by them. I do know some people who would like to commit violence against them, but saner heads.
Absolutely, they're, like I said, they're the world's biggest jerks. The things they say are absolutely terrible and don't reflect, any sort of peaceful, loving faith. But again, because they haven't crossed that line, they don't really fall into the same category as some of these other groups that might say, for instance, like the KKK would be a more religious group in the U.S. here that did cross that line on multiple occasions.
Well, before we move on to the KKK, I do have to say when it comes to defeating the Westboro Baptist Church and their slogans, nobody better than the Patriot Guard, a couple thousand Patriot Guard riders and their motorcycles. Now,
there's got to be something. They're such a small group, but they seem to have a very loud voice.
Unfortunately, they do, but you try screaming over 1,000 roaring motorcycles.
That's going to be difficult.
Exactly. Gotta love the Patriot Guard. All right, so back to the KKK. They are, in your mind, a religious terrorist group, and they're right here in America. Now tell me why they fit your definition of a religious terrorist group. And for those people who may have forgotten the definition of a religious terrorist group, can you give us just a thumbnail version one more time? That way they can see the point we're trying to make.
Sure. Religious terrorism is any sort of terrorism that is carried out that have some sort of motivation or some sort of religious influence or goal to their actions. Now, the KKK is another interesting one because you'll actually see a lot of people argue that they aren't terrorists simply because their goals were a lot more personal in nature. They weren't as widespread politically. I personally would classify them as such, but they are a little bit more on the line than several other groups. A lot of times the violence they committed was against people they personally knew, the person who lived down the street or the person who, the African American, who did something that they thought was wrong, and they would go after that person individually. Whereas most terrorism has some sort of symbolic target, but they don't really care about the individuals themselves. So there is some debate about that. But the fact is, this is a group that carried out a lot of violent actions based on a political ideology, and they defended a lot of it, or tried to justify a lot of what they're doing with religious ideology as well.
All right, so that, in your mind, puts them right in the terrorist spectrum.
I think so. I mean, I think they're kind of at one end of it, the lower end, where there is some debate there, as I mentioned. But I think the acts that they committed, they certainly committed terrorist acts. Whether you would classify them as a terrorist group or not, I guess depends on the definition you're using. But they certainly committed the acts necessary to classify them into that category.
All right, I can see your point on that. All right, so what other, while we're on the discussion of religious terrorist groups, I got to admit, unless you go back to the IRA, I don't see a modern-day band of Catholics running around blowing people up. Or am I mistaken that the IRA pretty much was the last time we saw Catholic terrorism?
Catholic terrorism, I'm having a hard time coming up with one. But I think that raises an interesting point, too, that, Islam is not the only faith that has seen religious terrorist groups over the years. I mean, we've seen, I mentioned on the last show that the group in Japan, Aum Shinrikyo, that was kind of a weird religious cult. They committed acts of terror. You have the LRA in Africa, the Lord's Resistance Army, led by the infamous Joseph Kony. That's a terrorist group as well that's not Islamic in nature. We even had here in the United States the JDL, the Jewish Defense League. That was back in the 60s to maybe 90s or so. They committed several acts of terror as well here in the U.S. And that was a Jewish group in particular. So there have been other groups that fit the same category. But by and large, they have been mostly Islamic in nature during this particular religious wave.
All right, so the Muslims are the Islamists, and I'm talking about the radical ones. Mm-hmm. Your average mosque-going neighbor who goes to prayers on Fridays and keeps a halal diet is not the problem. It's the ones who...
No, of course not. And most Muslims don't. Most Muslims aren't even sympathetic. The grand majority don't fit this category. But for whatever reason, most terrorist groups today, anyway, seem to have an Islamic background or be Islamist in nature in some way or form, in some shape or form.
Right. So the thing of it is do you think Islamists are going to keep this wave of terrorism going indefinitely, or at least as long as they can keep recruiting?
I think that's a good question, and it raises some questions as to why I think Islam in particular seems susceptible to this. I think a lot of it stems from a couple factors that may go back into history. As you mentioned, a lot of this religious wave stemmed out of the Afghan War, which is when the Afghans fought against the Soviet occupier to kick the Soviets out, and it provided a lot of legitimization for their faith, because it was seen as kind of our faith in this little tiny country, beat the big bad atheist or secular superpower. And so provide a lot of legitimization for their faith, and it was seen as, hey, this Islamic group, beat the atheists, or beat back the secular Soviets. And so you saw a lot of groups spawn out of that exact conflict. Al-Qaeda has roots in it, the Taliban has roots in it, groups as far away as Southeast Asia have roots in that conflict. And so we've seen a lot of a lot of terrorist groups stem out of this one conflict in the Middle East, where it was seen as Islam beating the secularists. And so I think as long as they can provide some sort of legitimization for their faith, and in particular as long as they're able to recruit in the Middle East as well as overseas, from sympathizers, it's going to be hard to knock out this wave of terror. And they have a ripe crop of people who are ripe for recruiting, because it's a region that's very poor. It's a region that's seen a lot of infighting. It's a region that, on average, tends to see more fundamentalist interpretation of doctrine than other faiths. Muslims on average tend to adhere more to more fundamentalist interpretations than other major faiths. We've seen that in a couple studies. And so there's this kind of group of people in the Middle East who are ripe for recruiting. They don't have a lot of other options. They're poor. and they have this kind of legitimization of this extremist faith that's been running rampant for decades, at least the last 20 to 30 years, and in some ways it goes back a lot longer than that.
All right. That's beginning to make sense, Justin, because you do have a lot of poverty in the area. You do have a lot of people who are adhering to a faith, and I have to note and tell you that one of the things, there's two things I'll defend: my faith and my country. And those can come in either order. Now, my whole take on religion, just to remind all my listeners, and just in case you're not a regular listener to Jesse's POV, you are welcome to practice any faith you want, as long as your faith doesn't constitute you coming to my house and trying to kill me for mine. Beyond that, I don't care if you belong to the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Feel free, have fun. Now, we've discussed the fact that there are other Islamic terrorist groups, and cutting off their recruiting seems to be the key. Now, the State Department has said, we'll just give them all jobs. We'll make a jobs program. First of all, we know how effective the U.S. government is at creating jobs here, never mind 7,000 miles away.
Yeah, it's been kind of a mantra of this current administration, is give them jobs and terrorism will go away. And I mean, there is a kernel of truth in that, and that there are some foot soldiers who join simply because there's nothing else to do. The problem is that doesn't defeat the ideology, and the ideology, is what drives the group, from the top down, essentially, from the leaders to the people. So while, giving them jobs may cut out a handful of people on the foot soldier, that's not going to get rid of the ideology. You need to have something else on the ground to combat it, some sort of alternative ideology. And that's where I think it gets really important to use the locals.
I agree with you. There's nothing can be more important than bringing in the local people to the fight, because it's the locals who are going to be left with whatever we leave. We're not going to stay there forever. Now,
absolutely. I certainly hope not.
For those people who say, well, World War II ended, we're still in Europe, we're still in South Korea, we have been invited by those countries to have a presence to help stabilize the region. We are a member of NATO. As part of NATO, we have bases in Europe. South Korea has invited us because technically that is a country still at war with its neighbor, North Korea. So they have invited us to help with peace and stability in the region. Japan invited us to stay on even after technically they could have kicked us out, because Japan has no army. Well, all right, it's not that they have no army. They have a really, really tiny one.
Mm-hmm.
So because of how we ended World War II, Japan is kind of dependent on us for self-defense. And
I think that raises a really good point, in that at the end of the day, this fight against ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever else, that's not our fight. That's the fight of the people in those regions. That's, at the end of the day, it's their fight much more than ours. I mean, we're only there because they've started, committing, international acts. I mean, we wouldn't be in Iraq if it wasn't for 9/11. We never would have gone there in the first place. Or at least the chance of us going there would be a lot less. We wouldn't have had the justification. So I think at the end of the day, because knowing that it's their fight, we have to let them, or at least embolden them and provide the resources to them to operate that fight on their own terms and using their own ideology, much more so than having this foreign invader come in and try to enforce democracy or whatever around the world. We haven't seen that work, and it's not something that's going to work. They need to know the people that offering this alternative ideology. They need to trust them, and they just don't trust some foreign invader from halfway around the world.
And I'm not sure they should, because guess what? That invader's going to go home at some point, and you're going to be left with a mess.
Exactly, and that's why we have to use people on the ground, because it's their country. It's their fight. They're the ones who are going to be left with whatever happens in the end, not the United States. And so while we can be there and support, I think at the end of the day, this has to be their fight primarily, with other countries just offering the resources or the backing in some ways.
So you're fine with us doing things like the Peshmerga going, hey, America, we're willing to do the fighting, but we need the weapons.
Giving weapons is a really tricky thing. We've seen this backfire on us again and again and again, so I tend to not like the idea of just handing over weapons to a group that just happens to be on our side for the moment. We've seen this backfire on us again and again and again. But I think in terms of providing other avenues of support,
airstrikes?
Things just like, I'm sorry, what?
Airstrikes?
We can provide, cover fire, we can provide airstrikes. I think having some troops there is good, but I'm not a huge fan of putting American weapons in the hands of a group that just happens to be on our side, right now, because we've seen that blow up in our faces.
On multiple occasions. And while, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge supporter of our military, and I'm a huge supporter of this country. Every country makes mistakes, folks. Ours just sometimes happen to be bigger and come back with shark's teeth to bite us.
Absolutely. I mean, the U.S. has been the hegemonic power in the world for a while now, ever since the Soviet Union fell. And so we tend to be the one that's involved in more things. And the U.S. has been involved in more armed conflicts around the world than any other country in the last 50 years or so. Partly that's just because of, where we are the strongest power. But partly because we also tend to get involved in these conflicts and get overly involved when we should be more emboldening the people who live there to fight their own battles.
Now, Justin, I got the question of the day for you. How do we get the politicians and the people up in D.C. to listen to you?
Well, that's a whole other problem. That's not one that I'm going to be able to solve. I mean, historically, we see a big divide between the political scientists, the ones who study this, and the ones who actually make policy. And historically, there's always been a problem communicating that the politicians who make policy don't like listening to other people, by in part the fact that they got into power simply by being the most charming individual. They think that they know everything. And so we have to find some way to either elect new people who are willing to listen to those who actually study this, for a living, or we need to find some way to convince the ones who are already there that what they're doing isn't working. As for how we go about doing that, I'm not sure, other than a complete overhaul of the system, which, again, they would have to approve. So I don't know that that's going to work a whole lot.
Good luck.
But yeah, that may be one of the trickiest parts of all, is getting the politicians to listen. I do think there are a handful in Congress who do, but by and large, most of the ones in Congress are not there, to serve, the ones or to listen to the ones who are actually doing the research and actually studying a lot of this.
Now, I know we've kind of run down a rabbit trail. We tend to do that, but I'm fine with it because I think we've covered what we were trying to cover, and the rabbit trails, I think, just add flavor and color.
Yes, they do.
So, other than trying to do a complete overhaul in D.C., which I think would take a lot more time and effort than either you or I have, and trying to get actual politicians to actually, hey, wake up, smell the coffee.
And I would argue with the current election cycle, we're actually moving in the wrong direction on that as well. So it's not even moving in the right direction.
Oh, to quote one of my show hosts from another show, America Off the Rails, Rick Robinson, we've got a choice between the criminally insane and a criminal.
Yeah, so we, as a country, we deserve what we're going to get with this next election. So whatever it is, we're going to deserve it 100%.
Like I said, it's the next 4 to 8 years is going to be a roller coaster. Fasten your seatbelts, folks. All right, on that note, as we do at the end of every show, why don't you give out your social media and any other contact or background information you want to give? And people, if you want to yell about the show content, you can email me at jessiespov@klrnradio.com. I will pass either positive or negative comments on to Justin. So if you want to yell about the content, it's my show. I'll take the heat. Now, Justin.
All right.
Your contact information.
Sure. So the best way to contact me is probably through Twitter right now. I have my personal account, which is Justin R_Kinney. And then I have an author account. I've mentioned on here in previous shows I am a fiction author. I wrote a book called Precipice. It was written under my middle name, J. Robert Kinney, and I have that as a Twitter handle as well. And then I also have an author page on Facebook. That's just J. Robert Kinney, and you can find me there as well.
All right. Well, as always, Justin, thank you for teaching us more than we knew about the region of the Middle East and helping us develop our religion scorecard. And for those of you who are regular listeners to Jesse's Coffee Shop, I got a surprise. I'm going to sneak in an episode on this Sunday about a special book called Precipice by J. Robert Kinney. And with that,
sounds great. I'll definitely be listening.
And he didn't even know that, folks, until right now. So, all right, with that note, you know what's coming. I'm out of here!